Success is achieved by preserving certain values in the case of war. These values are soldiers and ammunition. When we look at the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war, we see that Russian army is rapidly losing the values that will ensure success because the Ukrainian army continues to blow up military bases and ammunition depots of the Russian invaders one by one. The Russian army, which is losing thousands of soldiers and tons of ammunition every day, has developed a new tactic to prevent these losses. But the Ukrainian army quickly solved the tactic developed by the Russian invaders. So what was the tactic developed by the Russian invaders to keep their depleted ammunition? How did the Ukrainian army solve this tactic? Let's analyze together. In the first year of the war, the Russian army lost dozens of ammunition depots as a result of successful attacks by the Ukrainian army. The Russian army needed to prevent these losses in order to continue the war because the loss of even one ammunition depot meant the loss of dozens of achievements. Russian commanders developed the truck depot tactic to solve this problem. According to this tactic, ammunition belonging to the army would be stored in trucks. Trucks loaded with ammunition would be stationed in one area. This would give the area the appearance of a garage rather than an ammunition depot. But there was the fact that the Russian army, as always, forgot the Ukrainian army had been following this tactic all along. The recent explosions in the town of Kyat-Suka in Luhansk Oblast blew up the tactic developed by the Russian army. Ladiivka is one of the most important supply centers of the Russian occupiers. The Russian army supplies the weapons and ammunition needed by many fronts in the occupied territories from this region. Since the Ukrainian army had this important information, it was closely following the developments in Ladiivka. Reconnaissance drones of the Ukrainian army frequently flew over the skies of the city of Ladiivka and thus were able to monitor the activity in the region in real time. Recently, the activity in Ladiivka attracted the attention of the Ukrainian army because many civilian trucks were parked at a local factory in Ladiivka. The Russian invaders chose civilian rather than military vehicles for this tactic. This way they thought they would not attract attention, but the inexperience of the Russian army soldiers revealed the truck warehouse tactic. Ukrainian army reconnaissance drones spotted Russian soldiers in camouflage getting out of the trucks parked at the factory. The trucks were civilian, but the soldiers were in camouflage. Having caught this detail, the Ukrainian army only had to launch the attack. The Ukrainian army waited for the most opportune moment to blow up the truck depots in Ladiivka, because the number of trucks parked in the area was rapidly increasing. If the Ukrainian army had launched the attack as soon as it detected this tactic of the Russian occupiers, few trucks would have been blown up. Therefore, they waited patiently for the trucks to be placed in the area. After the Russian occupiers parked all the truck warehouses at the factory in Ladiivka, the Ukrainian army fired its long-range missiles. When the missiles hit the trucks, huge fireballs rose into the sky over Ladiivka. Each of the trucks contained thousands of tons of ammunition, which increased the intensity of the explosions and the fire. Once again, the Russian army suffered a huge loss due to inexperienced soldiers. Sarah Heidi, head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration, commented on this development in Ladiivka. In a statement on his Telegram account, Heidi said in Ladiivka the Russians tried to hide their trucks with ammunition on the territory of the local factory. An explosion occurred. The Russian army lost thousands of tons of ammunition in a tactic to preserve its dwindling ammunition. Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the military authorities have been trying to prevent the Russian army's decline against Ukraine with a series of measures and tactics, but without success. It is becoming clear every day that the Russian army will lose this war, just like the tactics tried and failed by the Russian army. Russian leader Vladimir Putin tried many different strategies during his invasion of Ukraine, but Putin also failed in his strategies. One of the most important of these strategies was to change the commanders in charge of the occupation of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin changed 2 commanders within 3 months. General Sergei Surovikin was dismissed after the setback against Ukraine. General Valery Gerasimov replaced Surovikin. However, Putin's move failed to prevent the regression against Ukraine. In fact, the Russian army suffered war casualty during Gerasimov's tenure as a commander in charge of the occupation of Ukraine. From the day Russia started its occupation of Ukraine until March 1, 2023, its losses are as follows: 149,890 military personnel, 3,395 tanks, 6,638 armored combat vehicles, 2,393 artillery systems 479, reactive spread fire systems 247, air defense systems 300 aircraft, 288 helicopters, 5,257 automotive and tank equipment, 18 military ships and boats, 873 cruise missiles, 2055 unmanned aerial vehicles, 230 special machines for Operation Tactile Missile Systems. The Russian army has faced many unexpected developments since it began its occupation of Ukraine. The sanctions imposed on Russia by Western and European countries were the first of these developments. But Russian leader Vladimir Putin did not give up on his decision to invade Ukraine, despite thousands of sanctions imposed by dozens of countries. Another important development that Russia did not expect was the aid sent to the Ukrainian army. Western and European countries have provided billions of dollars worth of military aid to Ukraine. This aid helped Ukrainian army to strengthen and carry out successful operations against the Russian invaders. Putin, who was being quarried day by day, realized that the soldiers in the Russian army were insufficient in this war. A strategy had to be devised in the face of this situation. Putin first declared compulsory mobilization but failed to achieve the desired result. Putin devised a strategy to solve the troop problem. According to this strategy, Putin included Chechen soldiers loyal to Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, and soldiers belonging to the Wagner Group, a private military group in the invasion of Ukraine. Chechen soldiers and soldiers of the Wagner Group were deployed to occupied Ukraine regions where the Russian army was inadequate. The Wagner Group was particularly present in the Bakhmut and Soledar regions. Chechens were sent to the front to fill in the gaps in many different regions. But Putin's strategy weakened the Russian army even more. The Wagner Group did not listen to the orders of the Russian commanders and acted according to their own wishes. It also declared its successes at the front independent of the Russian army. Chechen soldiers were humiliated by the Russian army and the soldiers of the Wagner Group because of their race and beliefs. With these problems at the front, Chechen leader Kadyrov and Wagner Group boss Yevgeny Prigozhin began to criticize Putin as he got stronger, as with the tactics tried by commanders in the Russian army. Putin has failed in his strategies. Putin's failure made Prigozhin and Kadyrov even more ambitious because the people who rose up against the invasion of Ukraine wanted Putin to leave power. Kadyrov and Prigozhin realized this reality and attempted to gain a foothold in post-Putin Russian politics. Nowadays, Putin's relations with Prigozhin are particularly bad. Having lost in Ukraine, Putin is facing a bad end in Russia too. What are your thoughts? How do you assess the Ukrainian army's operation to detect and blow up truck depots? What kind of an end awaits Putin? What are your thoughts on the course of the war? The war between Ukraine and Russia began in the steppes of Eastern Europe, but over time, the effects of the war spread to much wider areas. Against Russia's occupation policies, almost all European countries gathered under one roof for the same purpose, especially in recent days. The north of Europe has started to pioneer this common goal with Finland's participation in NATO. The Scandinavian peninsula began to react much more harshly and jointly against Russia. This striking solidarity in the triangle of Sweden, Finland, and Norway created a bombshell effect with Norway's last critical step. Relations with Russia in the north were already tense. Now, with this decision taken by Norway, the relationship between Russia and northern European countries is getting worse. Let's explore this brave step of Norway together and see how Russia was shaken by this strong wind coming from Scandinavia and how this strong wind swept Vladimir Putin's men away. Beyond Ukraine, Washington and its European allies are ratcheting up pressure on Russia, including in the Arctic and Baltic Sea regions. In the past few years of East-West crisis, the U.S. military has vastly expanded its presence inside Norway, whose western border runs 1,400 miles along the North Atlantic Ocean and merges above the Arctic Circle with Russia. The Pentagon has created high-paying jobs and contracts amid some local controversy by investing hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade and expand American Navy and Air Force facilities in Norway. The new works included, most importantly, an advanced synthetic aperture radar far up north that was capable of penetrating deep into Russia and came online just as the American intelligence community lost access to a series of long-range listening sites inside China. Norway's air station north of the Arctic Circle is to become a regional hub for surveillance of Russia. Details on the joint project between the United States, Britain, and Norway were provided earlier this month in comments by Norwegian Minister of Defense, Bjørnar Gram, who said that the base will host US P-8, a Poseidon surveillance aircraft. Two Arctic bases of Venice and the Ramsund Naval Base are the subject of an upgraded bilateral defense cooperation agreement between Washington and Oslo. They are classified as agreed areas, which grant U.S. forces unimpeded access to the bases and exclusive rights to certain parts of them. The agreement provides for U.S. jurisdiction over all U.S. Army personnel in the country, including for crimes they commit off-duty and even over Norwegian citizens who come into contact with the agreed areas. Washington initiated talks on the bilateral agreement, and the Biden administration said the deal was an invariable requirement for further U.S. investment in Norwegian facilities. The opportunity to store equipment and material in advance, which is included in the Norwegian-American agreement, clearly expresses the American commitment on agreed areas in Norway. Defense Minister Graham said at Venice the aim is to develop cooperation between Norwegian, British, and American P-8 maritime surveillance aircraft in accordance with the investments that are made in the Norwegian Armed Forces long-term plan. These include 5 P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft bought by Norway, which will work with British Poseidons to search for and destroy underwater targets, i.e., submarines. Evans also hosts Norway's US-produced F-35 fighter jets. Ramsund will serve as a maritime logistics hub for large-scale military activities in the region by the US and other NATO powers. Graham said, in the current long-term plan for the defense sector, it's planned that the Ramsund Naval Base will have an expanded role as the Navy's base in the north, and that the base is further developed to support the Navy and allies, including expanded key facilities, storage, ammunition, logistics, and maintenance. Our NATO allies train and exercise regularly in Norway, something that may also involve periodic presence in connection with logistics support. Increased cooperation with the US and other allies at Evans and Ramsund is desired and will provide economies of scale and increased operative effect. Meanwhile, in the shadow of Washington-Oslo cooperation against Russia's aggression, the tension between Norway and Russia is escalating, with the measures taken by the Norwegian administration against the Russian embassy. Norway has declared 15 people persona non grata working at the Russian embassy in Oslo. Russian diplomats are defined as members of intelligence services that engage in activities incompatible with their diplomatic status. These diplomats are required to leave the country, the Norwegian government website reported. Norwegian Foreign Minister Anniken Huitfeldt described the deportation as an important step in countering and reducing the level of Russian intelligence activity. Norway aims to protect its national interests by deporting 15 Russian diplomats it accuses of espionage in Norway's message. Moscow is cited as the main source of espionage threat for Oslo. It was also noted that the country would welcome diplomats from Russia, but Russian intelligence services would not be allowed to work under diplomatic guise. Foreign Minister Anniken Huitfeldt announced that they will not issue visas to intelligence officers who apply for visas to Norway. Anniken Huitfeldt did not elaborate on whether the government's decision was based on a particular event. Huitfeldt stated that the country's internal intelligence service will make the necessary statement on the subject. The Norwegian newspaper VG wrote that the number of expelled Russian diplomats was so high for the first time. The newspaper stated that about 40 people work at the Russian embassy in Oslo and the Kirkenes and Barentsburg consulates, including the deported diplomats. The retaliatory response to Norway's decision to expel the Russian diplomats came without delay. The Russian embassy in Norway described this critical decision as an extremely hostile step and announced that it would retaliate against it. 15 Norwegian diplomats are expected to be expelled, according to Russia's threat of retaliation. Minister Huitfeldt reacted to the statements of retaliation. Huitfeldt said Russia has no reason to respond. We have Norwegian diplomats in Russia, but none of them are intelligence officers, stating that his country wants to establish normal diplomatic relations with Russia. Huitfeldt stated that they do not want people who claim to be diplomats and are actually intelligence officers. In addition, Norway expelled 3 Russian diplomats last year for allegedly being intelligence officers. On the other hand, blows are coming from Norway to Russia, one after another. Norway, which expelled 15 Russian diplomats, also decided to impose new sanctions on Russia. Norway has launched a new set of sanctions against President Putin and the Russian regime. These sanctions reflected the EU's 10th package of sanctions adopted by the EU on February 25, 2023. The sanctions are becoming more and more extensive and represent a strong and clear European response to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Norway's powerful energy sector has been a major beneficiary, together with the United States, of sanctions on Russia and the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. Norwegian natural gas exports to Europe rose 3.3% in 2022. Deliveries to Germany shot up to 11% year-over-year. Norway has complied with the EU sanctions against Russia with several adaptations. Sanctions are implemented in Regulation 1076 of the 15th of August 2014 on restrictive measures regarding actions that undermine or threaten Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence, and stability. These sanctions imposed by Norway, including an import ban and a price cap on crude oil and petroleum products, are hitting the Russian economy hard. In February, Russia's oil sector tax revenues fell by 46% compared to the pre-war period. On the other hand, with the departure of Russia, Norway became the energy champion of Europe. Norway is now the continent's largest supplier of natural gas, and last year, the country's energy earnings increased by $100 billion. The new front line for Europe's energy security is a modest office building overlooking a fjord in Stavanger, Norway. Inside, a company called Petoro manages 36 of Europe's largest oil and gas fields on Norway's oil-rich continental shelf. These operations in Norwegian waters, marked by massive offshore platforms and wells twisting thousands of feet below the ground, have helped Europe heat its homes and generate electricity since the start of Russia's war in Ukraine. While Russia restricted its natural gas exports last year, Norway accelerated this export and is now the main fuel supplier to Europe. Norway also supplies more oil to its neighbors, replacing embargoed Russian oil. In short, the war in Ukraine helped add nearly $100 billion to Norway's oil and gas earnings. In other words, Oslo both supported Kiev in this war and strengthened its economy much more by taking advantage of Moscow's mistakes. On the other hand, Norway, a small country bordering Russia, is not a member of the European Union, but listens closely to its neighbors. After the war broke out, Brussels and European countries, mainly Germany, heavily dependent on Russian gas, leaned on Oslo for help. Norway already produces high volumes of gas and transports it to Northern Europe via subsea pipelines. but the Oslo government has allowed additional production. Energy companies made adjustments that increased gas production at the expense of oil. The result was an 8% increase in Norway's gas production last year, making Norway a source of about a third of the gas consumed in Europe. Norway has collected nice financial rewards for coming to Europe's aid. Petoro, 20, made nearly $50 billion, nearly 3 times its 2021 earnings, as energy companies like Shell and BP posted record profits last year. According to the estimates of the Oslo government, revenues from oil and gas contributed $125 billion to the Norwegian state in 2022. It seems that the Ukrainian war helped boost the Norwegian economy while undermining the Russian economy. Norway, on the other hand, seems to have sworn to corner Russia in addition to the political and economic tensions. Norway is following the Russians on the coasts. Norway watches cautiously with Russian submarines and planes accelerating Arctic patrols. NATO ally Norway has announced that it has increased the number of maritime patrols near vital undersea gas pipelines off its coast. In addition, Norway released a video clip of the growing Russian threat in the Arctic. Videos provided by the Royal Norwegian Air Force provided critical data near a maze of undersea pipelines carrying large quantities of natural gas to Europe and telecommunications cables connecting European countries. There is a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game between the two armies and the Russian attack submarines patrolling the area. The chief of the Royal Norwegian Navy noted that military activity around Norway has increased in the high north in the North Atlantic. The president stated that Russian submarines work differently than they did 10 years ago. The increase in military activity came as tensions escalated between NATO and Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. After a drastic decline in Russian natural gas flows to Europe, Norway has replaced Russia as the continent's largest supplier. Since an unexplained attack on the Nord Stream gas pipeline linking Russia and Germany last year, Norway, backed by NATO allies, has increased the security of its vast network of offshore pipelines and communication cables. Norwegian Foreign Minister Anniken Huitfeldt said in an interview in Oslo that after explosions, we actually increased our presence on these facilities. The submarine, naval, and air capabilities of the Russian Northern Fleet are largely unaffected by the war in Ukraine. Analysts say that Russia has invested heavily in its submarine fleet, making its boats quieter and more deadly. The new Belgorod submarine is designed to carry huge 25-meter-long nuclear torpedoes, as well as smaller mini-submarines capable of rescue or research. In summary, we'll wait and see if the escalation of tensions between Russia and Norway will affect Russia's war performance. There are a lot of updates from the Donetsk region. Here, the Russian command realized that even if they suppress the revolt and force the Marines to conduct another offensive operation, it would just be another catastrophe. They decided to urgently relocate a rifle brigade in this region and separate Wagner forces detachments when Ukrainians conducted an extensive hammer strike and destroyed the main transportation center that connected east and south. Last time I told you that Russian Marines and some irregular formations refused the order to launch another offensive operation on Volodar due to the extensive losses and lack of equipment. I also told you that Russian command took urgent measures to suppress a mutiny and Centrosgvardia in the region. Recent social media footage confirmed that the Russian command decided to replace the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade with the 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade. It looks like they understood that the demoralized soldiers that watched half of their brigade die over the course of 3 weeks would not be capable of conducting prolonged offensives. Nonetheless, their problems did not end here because the 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade started demanding Russian military command to provide them with more artillery shells and ammunition before they replace the Marines. However, even if they receive all the necessary supplies, armor, and ammunition, this one-for-one replacement does not represent a Russian reinforcement of the offensive effort. Internal dynamics within the Russian military is likely driving the potential resumption of the coastal offensives in the short term. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu reportedly ordered Eastern Military District Commander Muradov to take Bahadir at any cost to settle widespread criticism about the lack of progress and significant losses in the Volodar area. It looks like Muradov managed to convince Shoigu during the recent meeting that they need significantly more manpower and equipment reserves to follow through on Shoigu's reported instructions, and that a mere substitution of one brigade with another does not represent a notable fraction of the reinforcements required. Because locals continued reporting about the increased movement of Russian forces in the Mariupol area. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces would need to advance upwards of 24 kilometers from the current front lines around Volodar for this offensive to support operations elsewhere in the Donetsk region. In order to achieve it, Russians continued relocating troops to this region. As you might have noticed, Russians are always using columns with civilian buses in order to transfer their manpower from Donetsk to Mariupol. This is because there is no railway connection between these 2 points. There is one railway, but it goes along the front line, which makes it inoperable. In order to constrain the Russian transfer of troops, Ukrainians conducted a hammer strike against a Russian transport hub in Volnovakha. Their main target became an auto transport enterprise with a lot of buses. Geolocated imagery confirmed that Ukrainians inflicted severe damage to the building and, according to Russian sources, destroyed at least 10 buses. This is almost half of the potential column that Russians usually use for relocating forces. Today, Ukrainians have also reportedly conducted a hammer strike against a Russian base in Mariupol. Geolocated footage indicated that the target of this strike became the base located in the western part of the city near the airfield. Around a week ago, Ukrainians destroyed here several ammunition depots, so it is highly likely that today's target became forces concentrations, especially given that the Ukrainian Mariupol mayoral advisor recently stated that Russians established a lot of camps where they stationed the newly arrived troops. Overall, Russian attempts to resume costly offensives around Volodar signaled that the Russians continued to dislocate already degraded forces to an operation that they are unlikely to carry out. The Institute for the Study of War pointed out that to make operationally significant gains, Russians would need to achieve a rate of advance that Russian forces have not achieved since the first month of the full-scale invasion. But because of personal motivations of the commanders involved, Russian forces in the area may resume these operations nonetheless. Russian failure here will likely give Ukrainians a strategic advantage because they will be able to start their counter-offensive operation not only in the direction of Melitopol, but also Mariupol.